The Dawn Siege. The sound that woke Jake Morrison wasn't the usual chorus of Montana birdsong or the lowing of his cattle in the distant pasture. It was the mechanical thunder of helicopter rotors slicing through the pre-dawn darkness. So close the vibrations rattled the windows of his farmhouse. His eyes snapped open, heart already racing with that primal instinct that something was catastrophically wrong. He rolled out of bed and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain with fingers that had begun to tremble. What he saw turned his blood to ice water. His 300-acre ranch, the sanctuary he'd retreated to after losing everything that mattered, was surrounded by an army. Vehicles formed a perfect perimeter around his property, their headlights creating an artificial dawn that banished every shadow. Black SUVs, armored trucks, and what looked like mobile command centers had transformed his quiet refuge into a military occupation zone. Men in tactical gear moved with practiced precision, establishing positions behind vehicles, on ridgelines, near his barn. Jake's mind struggled to count them. 50, 70. More kept emerging from the darkness. Over 100 armed federal agents had invaded his land while he slept. 2 helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their searchlights sweeping across his house, his outbuildings, the creek that wound through the eastern section of his property. The beams cut through the morning mist with surgical precision, hunting for something, hunting for someone. The loudspeaker crackled to life with a volume that made Jake flinch. Jake Morrison, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have your property completely surrounded. Come out of the house immediately, with your hands clearly visible above your head. You are suspected of harboring a dangerous entity and interfering with a federal investigation. You have 3 minutes to comply before we enter by force. Jake's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Dangerous entity. The words echoed in his skull as yesterday's events came flooding back with crystalline clarity. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been fixing the fence line in the north pasture. 24 hours ago, he'd been just another lonely widower, trying to fill his days with enough work to keep the grief at bay. 24 hours ago, he hadn't known that legends could bleed. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, forcing himself to breathe, to think. How had it come to this? How had a simple act of compassion transformed into whatever nightmare was unfolding outside his door? Jake Morrison had turned 52 last month, though he'd let the day pass without acknowledgement or celebration. Celebration required joy, and joy had died 3 years ago in a hospice room that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. Sarah had been his entire world for 27 years, and when the cancer finally claimed her, it had taken most of him too. He'd been a park ranger for nearly 3 decades, one of the best in Montana according to his supervisors. He knew these mountains, these forests, these wild spaces better than he knew himself. After Sarah's death, he couldn't bear to continue. Every trail reminded him of hikes they'd taken together. Every sunrise they'd once shared became a knife in his chest. So he'd taken his pension, bought this remote ranch, and disappeared into the kind of solitude that either heals you or destroys you. For 3 years, his life had followed a simple rhythm. Wake before dawn. Feed the 30 head of cattle he kept more for company than profit. Repair whatever the wilderness had damaged overnight. Read by lamplight until exhaustion granted him a few hours of dreamless sleep. Repeat. It wasn't happiness, but it was sustainable. It was safe. The routine had been identical yesterday. He'd spent the morning reinforcing the chicken coop against a persistent fox, the afternoon checking fence posts along his property line. The Montana summer sun had been generous. The sky that impossible blue that existed nowhere else on Earth. everything had been perfectly, numbingly normal. Until he'd gone to check the creek in the late afternoon and found the tracks. Jake had seen thousands of animal tracks in his career. Bear, elk, moose, mountain lion, wolf. He could identify species, estimate weight, determine direction and speed at a glance. But these tracks had stopped him cold, had made him question whether the isolation had finally broken something fundamental in his mind. They were footprints, unmistakably humanoid. But they were massive, each impression nearly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, pressed deep into the soft mud near the water's edge. The stride length suggested something well over 7 feet tall. The depth of the impressions indicated tremendous weight, far more than any human could carry. His ranger training had warred with his rational mind. There were only a few possibilities, and none of them made sense. An elaborate hoax seemed most likely. But who would trek miles into his property to plant fake tracks? And these weren't the clumsy forgeries he'd seen tourists attempt. These showed anatomically correct pressure points, natural variation, the kind of detail that couldn't be faked. The sun had been sinking toward the western peaks when he'd made the decision to follow them. Looking back now, with an army outside his door, it seemed like the choice of a different person. But yesterday's Jake had been curious, had felt the first spark of genuine interest in something beyond his own grief in 3 years. He'd tracked the prints deeper into his property, following them away from the creek and toward the ravine that marked his northern boundary. The forest had grown darker, the shadows longer. He'd been so focused on the tracks that he'd almost missed the blood. Dark droplets on the leaves, smears on tree bark, a trail of pain leading him forward into the gathering dusk. The loudspeaker barked again, shattering his memories. 2 minutes, Mr. Morrison. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. The blood trail had led Jake deeper into terrain he rarely visited, where the forest grew thick and the ground turned treacherous with loose shale. His heart had hammered against his ribs, not from exertion, but from the growing certainty that whatever he was tracking was hurt badly. The droplets had become splashes, the occasional smear becoming frequent streaks across rocks and undergrowth. Then he'd rounded a cluster of pine trees and found it. The creature lay collapsed against the ravine wall, partially hidden by scrub brush. Jake's mind had simply refused to process what his eyes reported. Every rational thought he'd ever had about the natural world shattered in that instant. Because there, bleeding and struggling to breathe, was something that wasn't supposed to exist. It was massive, easily 8 feet, even in its crumpled position. The body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, matted now with blood and dirt. The proportions were wrong for any bear, the limbs too long, the shoulders too broad. But it was the face that had frozen Jake in place. Not quite human, not quite ape, but something that existed in the uncanny space between. High cheekbones, a pronounced brow ridge, a flat nose, and the eyes, even glazed with pain, held something that made his breath catch. Intelligence, awareness, recognition of its own mortality. 3 wounds were visible, dark holes in the creature's torso and left shoulder, where bullets had torn through flesh. The blood flow had slowed to seepage, which Jake's first aid training told him could mean either clotting or the beginning of the end. The creature's breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Its massive chest rose and fell with obvious difficulty. Jake had stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, his mind racing through impossible calculations. This couldn't be real. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name people gave to campfire stories and blurry photographs, They weren't real. They couldn't be real. Yet here was evidence that would rewrite biology textbooks, that would validate decades of sightings dismissed as hoaxes and delusions. His second thought had been more practical and infinitely more dangerous. If this thing was real, and if someone had shot it, then someone knew it was here. Someone with guns and the willingness to use them. Someone who might not appreciate witnesses. The creature had stirred then, its eyes focusing on Jake with sudden alertness. A low sound had rumbled from its chest. Not quite a growl, but clearly a warning. One massive arm had shifted, the hand easily twice the size of Jake's own, fingers splayed in a defensive gesture. Despite its injuries, despite the obvious weakness, it was preparing to fight or flee. Jake had raised his hands slowly, palms forward, making himself as non-threatening as possible. Years of dealing with injured wildlife had taught him that wounded animals were unpredictable, driven by pain and fear. But this wasn't just an animal. Those eyes tracked his every movement with a clarity that suggested complex thought, evaluation, decision-making. Easy, he'd said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not going to hurt you. The absurdity of speaking to it had struck him even as the words left his mouth. But what else could he do? Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get far away from something that defied everything he knew about the world. Yet his ranger training, his years of helping injured creatures, pushed him forward. The creature needed water. That much was obvious from its cracked lips and the way its tongue moved sluggishly. Dehydration would kill it as surely as the bullets if left untreated. Jake had made a decision in that moment that would alter the trajectory of his entire life, though he couldn't have known it then. He would help. He'd backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact, showing the creature he meant no harm. It had watched him retreat with those eerily intelligent eyes, its breathing still labored but the defensive posture relaxing slightly. Jake had run back to his house, his mind spinning with the implications of what he was doing. He'd grabbed the largest water container from his barn, 5 gallons of clean well water. Then he'd raided his veterinary supplies, accumulated from years of treating his cattle. Antiseptic, gauze, antibiotics, meant for livestock, but effective on most mammals. The run back had seemed longer, his imagination conjuring scenarios where the creature had died or disappeared or worse, where armed men had already found it. But it had still been there, slumped against the ravine, its breathing even more shallow than before. Jake had approached more confidently this time, moving with purpose. He'd set the water container down about 10 feet away, then stepped back. The creature had watched him with what he could only describe as wary curiosity. When Jake made no further move, it had slowly, painfully, dragged itself toward the water. The desperation with which it drank had been heartbreaking, great gulps that splashed down its chest, its massive hands trembling as they gripped the container. It had drained nearly half the 5 gallons before pausing, and Jake had seen something shift in its expression. The immediate crisis of thirst satisfied, it seemed to truly see him for the first time. Their eyes had met across that small distance, and Jake had felt something pass between them, an understanding that transcended species. This creature knew he was helping. It recognized kindness, understood intention. The revelation had been staggering. Emboldened, Jake had moved closer with the medical supplies. The creature had tensed but didn't retreat. Working quickly, staying aware of those powerful arms, Jake had cleaned the wounds as best he could. The bullets had passed through, which was fortunate. He'd applied antiseptic, packed the worst wound with gauze, left the antibiotics within reach, with gestures he hoped conveyed their purpose. Jake returned to his house as the last light faded from the sky, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had flooded his system for the past 2 hours. He'd left the creature with water, medical supplies, and something he couldn't quite name. A fragile thread of trust between species that shouldn't have been possible. Sleep came in fractured intervals that night, his mind replaying every detail of those intelligent eyes, the deliberate way those massive hands had accepted his help, the undeniable consciousness behind that impossible face. He rose before dawn, driven by an urgency he couldn't explain. The creature might be dead. It might have vanished. It might have been a hallucination, born from too many years of isolation and grief. Jake dressed quickly, grabbed a flashlight, and headed back toward the ravine as the first gray light touched the eastern horizon. The site was empty. Only dark stains on the rocks and scattered medical supplies remained as evidence of what had transpired. Jake knelt beside the largest bloodstain, his fingers hovering over it without touching, as if contact might somehow erase the proof that this had been real. Massive footprints led away from the ravine, pressed deep into the soft earth near the creek, each one showing 5 distinct toes and a stride length that made his chest tighten with renewed awe. He followed the tracks for nearly half a mile, watching them lead deeper into the dense forest that bordered the northern edge of his property. Eventually, they faded into rocky terrain where even those enormous feet left no trace. The creature had gone home, wherever that was. It had survived the night. Jake felt an unexpected wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by a profound sense of loss. He would probably never see it again and never know if it fully recovered, never understand what had really happened in those strange hours. Back at the house, Jake made coffee with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The rational part of his mind insisted he should call someone, report what he'd seen. But who? The local sheriff would think he'd lost his mind. Wildlife services would laugh him off the phone. His ranger contacts would suggest he needed counseling for his grief. And something deeper, some instinct he couldn't name, warned him that involving authorities would be a terrible mistake. Instead, he grabbed his camera and returned to document everything. He photographed the tracks from multiple angles, used a ruler to show their massive scale. He collected samples of blood on gauze, sealed them in plastic bags with the methodical precision of his old ranger training. He sketched the scene in his journal, wrote detailed notes about every moment of the encounter, capturing it all while the memory remained vivid. Then he made the mistake of going online. A simple search for Sasquatch encounters brought up thousands of results, most obviously fabricated or sensationalized. But as he dug deeper, filtering through the noise, a pattern began to emerge that made his coffee turn cold in his cup. Credible witnesses, people with backgrounds in law enforcement, forestry, military service, describing encounters that matched his own experience. And in the comments, in the follow-up reports, a disturbing consistency appeared. Government intervention, immediate and overwhelming. Witnesses visited by federal agents, threatened with prosecution, forced to recant, evidence confiscated. In several cases, the witnesses themselves had disappeared from public life entirely, their social media going dark, their homes sold, their families relocated. One former park ranger in Washington had posted a detailed encounter report, complete with photographs. Within 48 hours, every trace of it had been scrubbed from the internet. Jake found only cached fragments, deleted forum posts, broken links leading nowhere. His stomach knotted as he read. He'd documented everything. He'd created evidence. He'd made himself a target for whatever apparatus worked to keep this secret buried. Jake stared at his photographs, at the blood samples on his kitchen counter, at the journal filled with his precise handwriting. The smart thing would be to destroy it all, pretend it never happened, return to his quiet, isolated life. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't. This was real. This mattered. Some truth was bigger than personal safety. He compromised, backing up all his files to an encrypted drive that he hid in his barn, then deleting the originals from his computer. He stored the blood samples in his freezer, buried beneath months of frozen food. The journal went into a waterproof container in his cellar. If they came, they wouldn't find everything. Not easily. The black SUV appeared that afternoon, parked conspicuously on the county road where it intersected with his private drive. No government plates, no markings, just tinted windows and an aggressive idling presence. Jake watched it through binoculars from his porch, his heart rate climbing. It sat there for 3 hours before driving away, but the message had been clear. We know. We're watching. That evening, a drone passed over his property. Not the cheap consumer model his neighbor's kid flew occasionally, but something larger, more sophisticated, equipped with cameras that tracked his movements as he fed his cattle. Jake waved at it sarcastically, a gesture of defiance that felt hollow. He was a single man on an isolated ranch, facing resources and authority he couldn't begin to match. His phone rang just after sunset. Unknown number. Jake answered, said hello twice, heard only silence before the line disconnected. It rang again 20 minutes later. Same thing. Then again. And again. The psychological pressure was deliberate, professional. They wanted him frightened, compliant, ready to cooperate when they finally made direct contact. Jake spent the evening preparing. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist, wasn't prone to paranoia, but 30 years of living in wilderness had taught him to prepare for threats, both animal and human. He secured his property, checked his weapons, made sure his truck had a full tank. He wrote a letter, explaining everything, addressed it to his sister in Colorado, left it unsealed on his desk, where it could be easily found. The loudspeakers shattered the dawn silence with mechanical violence, ripping Jake from restless sleep. His eyes snapped open to red and blue lights strobing through his bedroom window, painting the walls in urgent warning colors. The voice that followed was amplified, authoritative, stripped of anything resembling negotiation. Jake Morrison, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your property is surrounded. Exit the front door with your hands visible and interlaced behind your head. You have 3 minutes to comply. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he stumbled to the window. What he saw turned his blood cold. His ranch, his sanctuary, had been transformed overnight into a military occupation zone. Vehicles everywhere, dozens of them, ranging from black SUVs to armored personnel carriers that had torn fresh tracks through his pasture. Men and women in tactical gear moved with practiced efficiency, establishing perimeter positions, checking equipment, weapons held ready but not quite aimed. He counted quickly, his ranger training kicking in despite his shock. Over 200 agents, maybe more. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors creating a constant thunder that vibrated through the house's wooden frame. This wasn't an arrest. This was a siege. Jake dressed quickly, hands shaking as he pulled on jeans and boots. His mind raced through options, all of them ending badly. Running was impossible. Fighting was suicide. Compliance was his only choice, though every instinct screamed that walking out that door meant losing control of everything that happened next. He thought of the encrypted drive in his barn, the blood samples in his freezer, The letter on his desk. Had they already searched? Did they know what he'd hidden? The walk from his bedroom to the front door felt like miles. Through the windows, he could see the command structure taking shape, a mobile operations center being established on his own lawn, satellite equipment being deployed with military precision. This was coordinated, planned, massive. They'd been preparing this while he slept, moving into position in the darkness, waiting for dawn to announce their presence. Jake opened the door with his hands raised, squinting against the morning sun and the glare of spotlight beams still illuminating his porch. 20 weapons tracked his movement instantly, red laser dots dancing across his chest. He followed instructions mechanically, interlacing his fingers behind his head, moving slowly down the porch steps. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through his boots. Absurdly, he thought about his cattle, unfed, confused by the chaos invading their routine. Agents moved in immediately, professional and impersonal, patting him down with efficient thoroughness, checking for weapons, removing his phone and wallet. No one spoke to him directly. He was processed like cargo, guided firmly toward the mobile command center, a large tactical vehicle that hummed with electronics and air conditioning. The door opened, revealing an interior that looked like a high-tech war room, screens displaying thermal imagery of his property, communications equipment, tactical maps marked with positions and zones. The woman waiting inside radiated authority despite her compact frame. Mid-40s, Asian features, dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a suit that somehow remained crisp, despite the field operation surrounding them. Her credentials identified her as Special Agent Sarah Chen, and her eyes assessed Jake with the cold calculation of someone who'd conducted hundreds of interrogations. "Sit down, Mr. Morrison." Not a request. Jake sat in the bolted-down chair, noting the camera in the corner, the recording equipment, the 2 additional agents flanking the space. This was official, documented, designed to be legally defensible later. Chen remained standing, a position of dominance. "Do you know why we're here?" Jake's mouth was dry. "I can guess." "Then save us both time. Where is it?" "Where is what?" The defiance in his voice surprised him. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Impatience, maybe, or recognition that this wouldn't be simple. "The entity you made contact with 48 hours ago. The creature you provided aid and comfort to. The biological asset you helped escape federal custody." Biological asset. The clinical term made Jake's stomach turn. "I helped an injured animal. That's not a crime." "It is when that animal is part of an active classified federal operation." Chen pulled out a tablet, swiped through screens, turned it toward Jake. Surveillance photos filled the display. Him approaching the ravine. Him carrying water containers. Him kneeling beside the massive form, clearly administering treatment. Thermal imagery, showing the creature's heat signature, his own, the interaction between them. They'd been watching. The whole time, they'd been watching. "We've been tracking this specific specimen for 4 months, Mr. Morrison. It entered a restricted military testing zone in northern Idaho, witnessed classified weapons trials, became a security liability. Contractors were authorized to neutralize the threat. You interfered with that operation." Jake stared at her, processing the implications. "You were hunting it, trying to kill it." "Trying to contain a security breach," Chen corrected. "This creature possesses intelligence, Mr. Morrison. It can communicate, remember, potentially relay information. It saw things no civilian, no foreign power, no unauthorized entity can know about. That makes it dangerous." It's a living being with gunshot wounds who needed water. Jake's voice rose despite himself. I'm a former park ranger. I saw an animal in distress. I responded. That's what decent people do. Decent people don't compromise national security. Chen leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost conversational, which somehow made it more threatening. We know everything, Mr. Morrison. We've monitored your internet searches, your research into encounter reports, your evidence collection. We know about your backup files, your hidden samples, your documentation. This property is now a federal investigation site. Every inch will be searched. Every device will be seized. Your cooperation will determine whether you face obstruction charges or something more serious. Jake met her gaze, seeing the machinery of government power behind her eyes, the apparatus that could crush individual resistance without breaking stride. But he also saw something else, a tension in her posture, an urgency that suggested their control wasn't as complete as she wanted him to believe. They needed something from him, information he possessed, cooperation they couldn't simply take by force. I want a lawyer, Jake said quietly. Chen smiled, and it was the coldest expression Jake had ever seen. This is a national security matter, Mr. Morrison. Different rules apply. The silence that followed Chen's statement stretched like a wire pulled to breaking point. Jake understood now that he'd entered a realm where the normal rules of American citizenship had been suspended, where his rights existed only if they chose to acknowledge them. The mobile command center felt smaller with each passing second, the walls lined with monitors showing live feeds of his property from a dozen angles, agents moving through his barn, his house, his life. Let me tell you what we know about the Sasquatch population, Mr. Morrison. Chen's shift in approach caught him off guard. She gestured to another agent, who pulled up a presentation on the largest monitor. The federal government has maintained documented evidence of their existence since 1973. Not folklore, not myth, biological fact. The screen filled with grainy photographs, clear footprint casts, thermal imagery, even what appeared to be tissue samples with detailed genetic analysis. Jake's breath caught. Decades of cover-up, of dismissing witnesses as crazy, of official denial while maintaining secret files. Approximately 800 to 1,200 individuals across North America, Chen continued, her tone clinical, as if discussing any other wildlife population. Mostly Pacific Northwest, some in the Rockies, a few isolated groups in the Appalachians. We've tracked them, studied them from distance, maintained strict non-interference protocols. They avoid humans instinctively. We ensure humans who get too close are discredited or silenced. Silenced how? Jake's voice came out rougher than intended. Chen's expression remained neutral. Various methods. Usually financial incentives, non-disclosure agreements backed by national security classifications. Occasionally, more direct interventions. The point, Mr. Morrison, is that this arrangement has worked for 50 years. Both species maintaining separation, avoiding conflict, until your friend decided to go sightseeing in a restricted military zone. The screen changed to surveillance footage. Night vision showing a massive bipedal figure moving through what appeared to be a desert testing range. The creature moved with purpose, pausing occasionally, clearly observing something beyond the camera's view. Then flashes of light, explosions in the distance, the distinctive trails of missile tests. The Sasquatch remained motionless, watching, and Jake could see, even in the grainy footage, the intelligence in that stillness, the comprehension. Experimental weapons systems, Chen said. Technology that won't be publicly acknowledged for another decade. and this creature watched the entire demonstration. 40 minutes of classified testing. Then it ran. The footage showed the figure fleeing, moving with surprising speed despite its size. Then muzzle flashes, the creature stumbling, continuing to run. The hunting party Chen had mentioned. Contractors with military-grade weapons pursuing an intelligent being across federal land like it was a dangerous animal. We tracked it for 3 days before it reached your property, Chen continued. Lost the signal in the forest density. Picked it up again when our surveillance detected your interaction. By the time our team arrived to contain the situation, it had disappeared again. With treatment. With renewed strength. Because of you. Jake processed the timeline, the implications. You're telling me your people shot an unarmed creature for witnessing something, then hunted it across state lines to finish the job. And I'm the criminal here? You're the complication. Chen's mask slipped slightly, frustration bleeding through. This creature can't be allowed to die, Mr. Morrison. Despite everything, it's part of a protected population under classified federal guidelines. But it also can't be allowed to remain free with the knowledge it possesses. We need to capture it, relocate it to a secure facility where it can be monitored, contained. Your treatment kept it alive but mobile. You created this stalemate. Secure facility. Jake tasted bile. You mean a cage. Permanent imprisonment for the crime of being in the wrong place. I mean protective custody for a being that represents both a scientific treasure and a security risk. Chen leaned back, studying him. You understand them, Mr. Morrison. Your background as a park ranger. Your obvious empathy for wildlife. You could help us resolve this humanely. Track it. Use your connection to draw it out. Allow us to administer sedation and transport. No harm comes to the creature. It lives out its life in comfort under observation. This situation ends cleanly. Jake heard the offer for what it was, a trap wrapped in reasonable language. They wanted him to betray the trust that had passed between him and the wounded creature at the ravine, to use compassion as bait. The thought made him physically ill. And if I refuse? Then we seize your property under eminent domain, charge you with obstruction of federal operations, ensure you spend the next decade fighting legal battles that will consume everything you have. Chen's voice remained level, almost gentle, which made the threat more effective. We'll find the creature eventually, Mr. Morrison. Our resources are unlimited. Your cooperation simply determines whether you emerge from this intact or destroyed. Before Jake could respond, the door opened and a younger agent entered. Someone Jake had noticed earlier, hovering at the edges of operations. Agent Marcus Webb, according to his identification badge, couldn't have been more than 30, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he still believed in the nobility of federal service. Agent Chen. Perimeter sensors are showing anomalous readings. Webb's voice carried an edge of uncertainty. Multiple large heat signatures approaching from the forest. Coordinated movement pattern. Chen stood abruptly, moving to the monitors. Jake followed her gaze to the thermal displays, watching as dozens of massive forms emerged from the tree line, surrounding the entire government perimeter in a loose circle. His heart hammered against his ribs as understanding dawned. They'd come for their family member, and they'd come in force. The thermal screens painted a picture that defied every protocol Agent Chen had ever trained for. 47 distinct heat signatures, each measuring between 7 and 9 feet in height, had materialized from the dense Montana forest, like ghosts becoming solid. They moved with purpose, but not aggression, establishing positions that mirrored the FBI's own tactical perimeter with unsettling precision. Jake watched Chen's professional composure fracture as she processed the impossible mathematics of the situation, her hand instinctively moving toward her sidearm before stopping midway, recognizing the futility. "All units, weapons hold!" Chen's voice crackled across every radio frequency. "I repeat, weapons hold. No engagement without direct authorization." The command center erupted into controlled chaos as field agents reported visual confirmation, their voices tight with barely suppressed panic. Through the reinforced windows, Jake could see the creatures themselves now. No longer just thermal abstractions, but physical beings standing at the forest's edge. They maintained perhaps 50 yards of distance, close enough to demonstrate capability, far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. The wounded Sasquatch stood at the center of the formation, flanked by two massive figures that could only be elders or protectors. Even from this distance, Jake recognized the creature he'd helped, noted the way it held its left side, where the worst gunshot wound had been. The family group displayed remarkable discipline, no individual breaking formation, no aggressive posturing. They simply stood, waiting, their presence transforming the government siege into something far more complex. Agent Webb moved between monitors, his face pale. "Ma'am, we're completely surrounded. They've positioned themselves to cut off every exit route, every tactical advantage we established. It's like they studied our deployment and countered it perfectly." His voice carried awe mixed with fear, the tone of someone watching their understanding of the world fundamentally restructure. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that transcended species barriers. The wounded creature had told them about his help, communicated across whatever complex social structures these beings possessed. They hadn't come for revenge or violence. They'd come in solidarity, a peaceful demonstration of protection for the human who'd shown compassion to one of their own. The realization brought unexpected moisture to his eyes. "They're not attacking," Jake said quietly, drawing Chen's sharp gaze. "They're not threatening. They're just making clear they won't let you take their family member without consequence." He moved toward the door, ignoring Chen's sharp command to stop. "Let me go out there. Let me try to communicate." "Absolutely not. You're a civilian in the middle of a federal operation, involving potentially dangerous—" Chen's protest died as one of the largest creatures took a single step forward, a deliberate movement that sent ripples of tension through every armed agent on the property. The message was clear without words. Time for talking among themselves had ended. Jake opened the command center door before Chen could physically restrain him. "You have two choices, Agent Chen. You can start a massacre that ends dozens of lives and destroys any chance of keeping this secret. Or you can let me walk out there unarmed and try to bridge this standoff. Either way, your operation just became something history will judge." The morning air hit Jake's face as he stepped outside, crisp with pine and the electric tension of two species facing each other across an impossible divide. Every weapon on the property tracked his movement as he walked slowly toward the creatures. Hands raised and visible, making himself deliberately vulnerable. His heart hammered so hard, he could feel it in his throat, but his steps remained steady. Behind him, he heard Chen barking orders to hold fire, her authority the only thing preventing catastrophe. 30 yards from the creature formation, Jake stopped. The wounded Sasquatch watched him with eyes that reflected intelligence, memory, recognition. For a long moment, nothing moved except the wind through the pines. Then the creature took 3 careful steps forward, separating itself from the group. The FBI perimeter tensed collectively, fingers hovering over triggers, but the creature's body language remained deliberately non-threatening. Jake saw the healing wounds more clearly now, the places where his amateur veterinary work had prevented infection, allowed recovery. The creature's breathing was stronger, its stance more stable. It had survived because of water and antiseptic, because of one human's choice to help, rather than harm. The creature's massive hand rose slowly, palm forward, in a gesture that needed no translation. Acknowledgement? Gratitude? Warning. I understand, Jake said softly, knowing his words mattered less than his tone. You came to protect your family, just like I would have protected mine. The creature's eyes held his, and Jake felt the weight of consciousness behind that gaze. The presence of a being with thoughts, emotions, social bonds as complex as any humans. These weren't animals. They were people, just shaped differently. Behind the wounded Sasquatch, the family group remained motionless, a living wall of solidarity. Jake counted elderly individuals, younger ones, what appeared to be family units standing together. They'd risked exposure, risked everything, because one of their own had been helped by a human, and now faced capture. The courage that required, the social organization, the capacity for loyalty across species lines, it rewrote everything humanity thought it knew about intelligence and consciousness. Agent Chen's voice crackled from a bullhorn. Mr. Morrison, step back slowly. We need to de-escalate this situation. But Jake heard the uncertainty beneath her command, the recognition that traditional tactical responses had become meaningless. You couldn't intimidate beings who'd survived millennia by avoiding human contact, who'd maintained secrecy through intelligence rather than luck. The wounded creature made a low sound, not aggressive, but communicative, and the family group responded with subtle shifts in posture. They were talking, Jake realized, coordinating without human language, but with perfect understanding. He was witnessing social complexity that anthropology had declared impossible, standing in the middle of humanity's greatest unacknowledged truth. Jake watched the silent communication ripple through the Sasquatch family, their coordination so subtle yet unmistakable, and understood he was witnessing something that would haunt him forever. The wounded creature turned back toward its family, then to Jake once more, a gesture that seemed to say everything words couldn't capture. Then movement erupted from an unexpected direction. Agent Marcus Webb pushed through the FBI perimeter, his service weapon holstered, hands raised in a gesture of peace that mirrored Jake's own. Chen's voice exploded through the bullhorn, ordering him back, but Webb kept walking until he stood beside Jake, facing the creatures with deliberate solidarity. His young face was set with determination that spoke of a decision made long before this moment. Agent Webb, return to position immediately. Chen's voice carried steel-edged authority, but Webb didn't flinch. He pulled something from his jacket, a small digital recorder that he held up for everyone to see, his voice carrying across the tense silence. I've been documenting this operation for 6 months, Webb announced, his words directed at Chen but meant for every agent present. Every illegal surveillance order, every constitutional violation, every threat made against civilians, it's all recorded, encrypted, and uploaded to secure servers with instructions to release everything to major news outlets if I don't check in every 12 hours. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and electric. Jake saw Chen's face drain of color, even from this distance, saw the ripple of shock move through the assembled agents. Several lowered their weapons slightly, uncertainty replacing their tactical focus. The Sasquatch family remained motionless, but Jake sensed their attention shifting, recognizing that the human dynamics had fundamentally changed. You're ending your career, Chen said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, but Webb shook his head. I'm saving it. I became an agent to protect people, not to hunt intelligent beings for witnessing something the government wants hidden. Half the people here know this operation crossed every ethical line we're supposed to uphold. Webb turned slowly, addressing the assembled agents directly. How many of you signed up to threaten ranchers? To hunt creatures that have never harmed anyone? To maintain a cover-up that serves politicians instead of citizens? Jake saw it then. The fracture lines spreading through the FBI perimeter. Agents exchanging glances, lowering weapons further, body language shifting from aggressive tactical posture to uncomfortable uncertainty. These weren't mindless enforcers. They were people who'd sworn oaths to protect and serve, now confronting the reality of what they'd been ordered to do. Chen's hand moved toward her radio, but another voice cut through the tension. A senior agent Jake hadn't noticed before stepped forward, his gray hair and weathered face suggesting decades of service. Agent Chen, I think we need to contact Washington before this situation deteriorates further. Agent Webb has a point about the legal exposure here. The admission seemed to break something in Chen's rigid control. She stood frozen for a long moment, calculating, weighing consequences that extended far beyond this Montana ranch. Jake understood her impossible position. Any aggressive action would create a massacre that Webb's evidence would expose. But retreat meant admitting defeat, acknowledging that the government's decades-long cover-up had become unsustainable. "You're forcing my hand," Chen said finally, her voice cold but resigned. She pulled out a satellite phone, the kind reserved for communication with the highest levels of authority. "This goes above my clearance level now. Everyone hold position while I get guidance from the director." The next 2 hours stretched like years. Jake and Webb remained standing between the FBI perimeter and the Sasquatch family, human bridges across an impossible divide. The creatures didn't move, didn't retreat, their patience suggesting an understanding of human bureaucracy that was somehow both absurd and profound. Jake found himself sitting on the ground eventually, exhaustion, overwhelming adrenaline, and the wounded Sasquatch slowly lowered itself to a similar position, a mirror gesture that several agents noticed with visible shock. Chen paced near the mobile command center, phone pressed to her ear, her body language cycling through frustration, anger, resignation. Jake caught fragments of her side of the conversation. Classified protocols, public exposure risk, unprecedented situation, containment versus elimination. Each phrase hammered home the reality that decisions about life and death, about truth and secrecy, were being made in Washington offices by people who'd never looked into a Sasquatch's intelligent eyes. Webb sat beside Jake, his earlier bravado giving way to nervous energy. "I might have just destroyed everything I worked for," he said quietly, and Jake heard the young man's fear beneath his courage. "Or you might have saved it," Jake replied. "What good is a career built on hunting innocent beings? You drew a line. That takes more courage than following orders." He thought of his own life, the choices made and not made, the years spent hiding from grief and isolation. Sometimes the hardest thing was standing up when everyone else stayed seated. The sun climbed higher, heat building despite the mountain altitude. Some agents began sitting, the tactical posture impossible to maintain indefinitely. Jake noticed food and water being passed around the FBI perimeter, the mundane human needs creating strange normalcy in the surreal standoff. One younger agent actually waved tentatively at the Sasquatch family, a gesture so absurdly human that Jake almost laughed despite everything. Finally, Chen lowered her phone and walked toward them, her face unreadable. Every eye, human and otherwise, tracked her movement. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to maintain some professional distance. When she spoke, Her voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "Washington has made a decision." Chen's words hung in the mountain air like a held breath, and Jake felt every muscle in his body tense for what came next. The agent's exhaustion mirrored his own, but beneath it, he detected something unexpected: relief, perhaps even reluctant respect. "Stand down," Chen said, her voice carrying across the perimeter. "All units, weapons safe, begin withdrawal protocol." The collective exhale from 200 agents was audible, tension releasing like a broken dam. Several younger agents visibly sagged, while others exchanged glances that mixed confusion with gratitude. Chin turned to Jake, and for the first time her professional mask cracked slightly. "Washington has authorized what they're calling a containment through cooperation protocol. No hunting, no capture, no elimination. These creatures remain undocumented officially, but protected through classified conservation status. You, Mr. Morrison, are being designated as primary civilian liaison, should contact become necessary." She paused, something almost human flickering in her eyes. "Congratulations. You've just rewritten 40 years of policy with one act of compassion." Jake struggled to process her words. The magnitude of what had just shifted in government corridors, far from this mountain clearing. "And if I refuse, if I just want my quiet life back?" "Your quiet life ended the moment you gave water to an intelligence our government has spent decades pretending doesn't exist," Chen replied, but without malice. "But refusal is your right. We'll monitor from distance. Intervene only if absolutely necessary. Agent Webb's insurance policy made certain of that." She glanced at the younger agent with something between anger and admiration. His evidence is now in enough hands that suppression became more dangerous than acknowledgement, at least at the highest clearance levels. Webb stepped forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by cautious hope. "The internal reform movement I mentioned? We've been documenting overreach for years, waiting for the right moment. This became that moment. There are others like me throughout the agency, people who believe secrecy has limits, that some truths deserve protection rather than burial." The Sasquatch family remained motionless, watching the human drama unfold with what Jake now recognized as patient intelligence. The wounded one met his eyes, and Jake saw acknowledgement there, perhaps even gratitude that transcended species. These beings understood negotiation, understood that the humans were resolving something critical to everyone's survival. Chen began coordinating the withdrawal, her commands crisp and professional despite the historic nature of the retreat. Vehicles started engines, equipment was packed with military efficiency, the siege apparatus dismantling itself with surprising speed. But Jake noticed certain agents lingering, stealing glances at the Sasquatch family, with expressions ranging from wonder to fear to something approaching reverence. This moment would haunt their careers, a secret they'd carry to graves, the day they stood down from hunting legends made flesh. As the last vehicles prepared to leave, Webb approached Jake one final time. "I'll be your contact," he said, handing over a card with a single encrypted phone number. "If anything happens, any threat to them or you, call immediately. The reform movement has your back now, and we protect our own." He glanced toward the creatures. "And apparently, we protect them too." "Never thought I'd see this day." "Why did you risk everything?" Jake asked, needing to understand the young agent's courage. Webb's smile was sad. "My grandfather was Salish. He told stories about the forest people, the ancient ones who walked before us. When I joined the FBI, I thought those were just legends. Then I read the classified files, saw what we'd been doing, the hunting and covering up. I couldn't be part of erasing what my grandfather knew was real. He extended his hand. You did the right thing, Jake. Sometimes that's all that matters. The convoy pulled away in clouds of dust, helicopters lifting off with thunderous rotor wash, and within 20 minutes, Jake's ranch returned to silence, broken only by wind and birdsong. But the Sasquatch family remained, and Jake understood they were waiting for something, some final acknowledgement of the covenant just forged. He walked slowly toward them, hands open and visible, heart pounding with residual adrenaline and profound awe. The wounded one rose, favoring its healing side, and moved to meet him halfway. They stood facing each other, man and legend, and Jake saw in those ancient eyes a wisdom that predated human civilization, a consciousness that had watched humanity's rise from the shadows. The creature extended one massive hand, palm up, and Jake understood the gesture's meaning: gratitude, respect, mutual recognition. He placed his own hand against that leathery palm, felt warmth and strength and the pulse of life that proved this was no monster, but a being deserving dignity and protection. The Sasquatch family turned then, moving as one back into the forest that had hidden them for millennia. But the wounded one paused at the tree line, looked back at Jake, and raised one hand in what could only be described as farewell. Then they were gone, melting into shadows and undergrowth, with impossible silence for creatures so large. Jake stood alone in his ranch yard, the morning sun climbing higher, and felt tears streaming down his face. Grief for his wife, held at bay for 3 years, finally released through the catharsis of this impossible encounter. Purpose, lost since her death, rekindled by the understanding that his simple act of compassion had prevented tragedy and forged unprecedented peace. Weeks passed. Life returned to surface normalcy, though Jake knew nothing would truly be normal again. He noticed signs of watchful presence, tracks appearing near his property line, arrangements of stones that seemed deliberately placed, the sense of being observed by protective rather than threatening eyes. The creatures were keeping their own watch, guardianship flowing both directions now. He returned regularly to the creek where he'd first found the wounded Sasquatch, leaving water containers as standing offerings. One morning he discovered a massive handprint in the mud beside his boot print, fresh and deliberate, a message that coexistence wasn't just possible, but actual. Jake understood then what his life had become: guardian of humanity's greatest secret, keeper of a truth that wisdom suggested should remain hidden until the world was ready. Some mysteries deserved protection, not exposure. His ranch had become a sanctuary, a neutral ground where ancient intelligence and modern humanity acknowledged each other across the species divide. Standing at the creek, watching water flow eternal and unchanging, Jake Morrison felt peace for the first time since loss had driven him to isolation. Compassion had transcended species. Simple kindness had rewritten history, and in protecting the unknown, he'd found himself again. The forest whispered with secrets humanity wasn't ready to know, and Jake smiled, knowing he'd keep them safe.